Actor online. Case file open. Every defender knows the perimeter is a fiction. But in December of 2013, the perimeter did not just leak. It walked in through a door Target never thought to guard. A door that belonged to a refrigeration contractor in Sharpsburg, Pennsylvania. A company whose business was keeping the milk cold. This is the case of Target Corporation. 40 million payment cards, 70 million customer records, and a vendor portal that turned an HVAC subcontractor into the most expensive supply chain liability in retail history. We are going to walk the full chain, from a single phishing email to the boardroom resignations that followed. Lock in. The intrusion did not start at Target. It started at Fazio Mechanical Services, a small HVAC and refrigeration vendor that serviced Target stores and had been granted access to Target's Ariba vendor management portal for billing and contract submission. An employee at Fazio received a phishing email carrying Citadel, a banking trojan built on the Zeus source code. Citadel was not sophisticated in the zero-day sense. It was commodity crimeware, sold in underground marketplaces, designed to harvest banking credentials and whatever else sat in the victim's browser session. The artifact a defender would see here is not in Target's logs. It is on a workstation at a third-party vendor. The initial infection vector, as reported, was a Citadel distributed phishing email. The alert, had anyone been watching, would have come from host-based detection on the Fazio endpoint, a process injection event, anomalous browser credential capture, a beacon to a known Citadel command and control domain. Nobody was watching. Once Citadel was on the Fazio workstation, it did what Citadel does. It scraped credentials, not just banking credentials. Whatever the employee typed or stored in the browser. That included the username and password used to log in to Target's Ariba vendor portal. Fazio had legitimate access to that portal because Target had granted it. The vendor needed to submit invoices, manage contracts, and interact with Target's electronic billing system. The forensic gap here is critical. The public record confirms credentials were stolen via Citadel and used to access Target's vendor portal. What is not publicly documented is whether the stolen credential was for the Ariba portal specifically, or a related Target external system. The defender's trace would be an authentication log on Target's external-facing portal. A successful login from a Fazio-associated IP. Then, within hours or days, a login from an IP that does not match Fazio's expected range. That delta is the breach. That is the moment the supply chain became the attack chain. With the stolen vendor credentials in hand, the attackers authenticated to Target's external vendor portal. This was not a hack in the exploit sense. There was no vulnerability in the portal. There was no SQL injection. There was no brute force. The credentials were valid. The door opened because someone had the key. From the vendor portal, the attackers found a path into Target's internal network. The public reporting indicates the portal environment had some connectivity to Target's internal corporate systems, and the attackers leveraged that to pivot. The specific artifact is the authentication event on the Ariba or vendor-facing system. A defender running identity analytics would look for impossible travel. A Fazio user logging in from the eastern United States. Then an hour later, the same credential authenticating from a different geography, or session token reuse from an unmanaged device. The log source is the web access log for the vendor portal. The field is the source IP. The alert is credential use from an AS number that does not belong to Fazio Mechanical. That alert, if it had been tuned, would have stopped the entire chain at stage 3. The lateral movement from the vendor portal into Target's internal network is the least publicly documented segment of this breach. What is confirmed is that the attackers reached Target's internal corporate environment and from there gained access to the network segment hosting point-of-sale terminals. They did not jump straight to the registers. They moved through Target's internal infrastructure, escalating privileges and mapping the network. This stage likely involved stolen internal credentials, lateral use of standard administrative tools, and traversal across trust boundaries that should have been isolated. The defender's view here is internal network telemetry, netflow data showing connections from the vendor portal subnet into corporate server ranges, Windows event logs showing credential use outside normal patterns, Active Directory logs showing access to systems unrelated to vendor billing. The specific signal is a connection from a vendor-facing host to an internal domain controller. There is no legitimate reason for a vendor portal system to authenticate against the domain controller that manages point-of-sale infrastructure. That connection is the kill point. Stage 4 is where segmentation failed. It is also where segmentation, had it existed, would have ended the attack. Once inside the point-of-sale environment, the attackers deployed custom malware that the security industry later labeled Captoxa, a variant of the BlackPOS family. This was not off-the-shelf crimeware in its final form. The malware was purpose-built or adapted to run on targets' POS terminals, which were Windows-based point-of-sale systems. Captoxa was designed to read track data from the memory of the POS process. When a card was swiped, the card data transited through RAM before being encrypted and transmitted. Captoxa grabbed it from RAM in that window. The artifact on the POS terminal is the malware binary itself, plus the memory access pattern. A defender with endpoint detection on the POS fleet would see a new process or injected DLL reading the memory space of the point-of-sale application. The log source is the endpoint detection and response agent, or the POS application's own crash and integrity logs. The specific indicator is a process calling read process memory on the POS executable. That API call from an unsigned binary on a register is the single highest signal event in the entire chain. Target did not have that detection on the POS fleet. That absence defined the next several weeks. The exfiltration ran for weeks. BlackPOS collected track data from cards as they were swiped at registers across Target stores nationwide. The stolen data was staged internally and then moved out to a command and control server controlled by the attackers. 40 million credit and debit card records were exfiltrated. In addition, Target disclosed that 70 million customer records containing names, mailing addresses, phone numbers, and email addresses were also taken. The exfiltration path involved moving data from the POS network to an internal staging server, then pushing it outbound over protocols that blended with normal traffic. The defender's artifact is the outbound network connection from an internal host that should not be making outbound connections. Specifically, a POS staging server or a compromised internal host sending large volumes of data to an external IP over FTP, HTTP, or a custom protocol. The log source is egress firewall logs and proxy logs. The signal is volume. An internal host in the POS or supporting infrastructure sending gigabytes outbound over days. That data is the cards. That is the 40 million. If egress filtering had been in place and monitored, the exfiltration would have been visible within the first 24 hours. It was not stopped for weeks. The breach was not detected by Target's internal security team acting in time. It was detected by the United States Secret Service. The Secret Service was monitoring a known malicious server as part of an ongoing investigation and observed stolen Target card data appearing on that server. The Secret Service contacted Target, and that external notification is what triggered the incident response. Target's own FireEye monitoring tools had in fact generated alerts on the intrusion, but those alerts were not escalated or acted on in time. The notification that mattered came from law enforcement, from a server the government was already watching for unrelated reasons. The artifact here is not a log, it is a phone call. A Secret Service notification to Target's leadership that stolen card data bearing Target's track data had been found on a monitored server. The defender's lesson is brutal. Every internal control had failed to stop the breach in time. The host-based detection on the POS fleet did not fire. The network monitoring did not flag the exfiltration. The identity monitoring did not flag the credential abuse. Even the alerts that did fire were not acted on. The detection that worked was a third party watching a different threat and stumbling into this one. When your detection depends on someone else's investigation, you do not have detection, you have luck. Where it dies. If we map controls to the stages, this chain breaks at 4 points. At ASIT 1, a basic endpoint detection and response agent on the Fazio Mechanical Workstation would have caught the Citadel infection before credentials were scraped. The control is managed EDR on all vendor endpoints that touch customer systems. At ASIT 3, identity-based anomaly detection on the vendor portal would have flagged credential use from an unknown IP or device. The control is impossible travel detection and managed device enforcement for all vendor portal access. At ACT4, network segmentation between the vendor portal and the internal corporate environment would have blocked lateral movement. The control is strict network zoning with no default route from vendor-facing systems to internal infrastructure. At ACT5, application-aware endpoint monitoring on the POS fleet would have caught BlackPOS reading POS process memory. The control is EDR on every register, tuned for memory access patterns against the POS executable. Any one of those 4 controls, if present and functioning, ends the chain. The Citadel Trojan was commodity malware. The vendor portal was a standard web application. The lateral movement used standard Windows tools. The POS malware read RAM using a documented Windows API. There was nothing exotic here. There was no zero-day. There was no nation-state tradecraft. There was a small vendor, a phishing email, a portal with too much access, a flat internal network, and a POS fleet with no endpoint monitoring. That is the entire breach. The controls are not advanced. They were absent. This case ended with the resignation of Target's CEO, Gregg Steinhafel, and the company's CIO. Target settled with 47 states for $18.5 million. The cost of the breach, including remediation, legal fees, and lost revenue, ran into the hundreds of millions. Stolen credentials from a refrigeration vendor's compromised workstation became the most expensive supply chain failure in retail history. If you want to hear how a breach like this feels from the inside, told as a dark cyber thriller narrative, go watch our sister channel, SYB3R. They retell real breaches as immersive stories, and the Target case is exactly the kind of slow-motion disaster they do best. Subscribe to this channel for more kill chain breakdowns and hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. Next episode. NotPetya, a nation-state wiper disguised as ransomware, pushed through a hijacked Ukrainian tax software update that used Eternal Blue and stolen credentials to spread to over 65 countries and cause roughly $10 billion in global damage. It looked like ransomware. It behaved like a weapon. Debrief complete. Go hunt.